Hey everyone, we're live again. We are at Midwest Chicana Podcast, and I have a very special guest with me today, Dr. Jean Chavez. Hi, Dr. Chavez, how are you?
Hey, doing great. Thank you. How are you surviving the COVID-19 thing? Okay.
It's pretty good so far. Everything's been going up well. How about you? How's everything going with you?
Yeah, no one in our immediate family or even extended family has reported any problems. So I think for the most part, people are hunkering down and maybe doing things at home that they wouldn't normally do.
Right, exactly. That's how our family is.
Yeah. I've been able to do a lot of writing and work on some of the history projects that I've been working on. So that's been great.
And it'll get you that extra time. I just want to tell you that I'm honored to have you here. Your name is a well-known name in Kansas City. We ourselves kind of met each other a couple years back and then just never reconnected, and we got reconnected again. And I was just so excited to have you on this podcast because you have been doing some amazing work for years, beyond years. I mean, just for a lifetime about culture, history, and especially in Kansas City. So can you tell us, let's just go ahead and get in it because I'm so excited. I know we have an hour and you have a lot of information that we want to share and talk about. And anyone out there, if you have questions for Dr. Chavez, please send them in and I'll get them here funneled to him so he can answer as well. So let's start with that. Like, what got you into this whole history, like being so involved and loving that?
Well, it really started as a kid when I grew up in Denver and Los Angeles, actually. And as a kid, we would often, every summer, my mom would go home for a month or so to northern New Mexico, Raton, New Mexico. She was actually born in Golondrinas, which is near Las Vegas, New Mexico. And so we as kids would go home with her, and there were five of us, and later six of us. So we would all gather at my grandmother's house in the evening after supper, and all of the adults would be in there talking in the salon, they called it, the living room. If the kids came into the salon, they had to just sit quietly and listen. They were supposed to be seen and not heard. Adults would be in there talking. So anyway, I just remember hearing some amazing stories that my grandparents, my mom, my tias that were still living at home would tell, about New Mexico. They would tell about how the Indians used to come to New Mexico where they were and trade. The Plains Indians would come in winter up against the mountains there in the San Juan Mountains in New Mexico. And all of those stories of their ancestors and their ancestors that came from Spain way back in the 1700s and settled in New Mexico. And I was just always fascinated. As I got older, when I go down with my mom, I remember taking her for her 80th birthday to go to a reunion, her family on her mother's side reunion. And I took a little tape recorder with me and got to do some amazing interviews with some of the familia down there in New Mexico. I remember a great aunt who lived to be 100 years old. She was my grandmother's, excuse me, my grandmother's sister. So my mom's aunt and my great aunt, Tia Petra, we called her. And so I asked her in Spanish, Tia, ¿por qué no hablas inglés? Why don't you speak English? And she said, ¿Pa qué? Yo no fui a ellos. Ellos vinieron a mí. I didn't go to them. They came to me. They want to talk to me. She said in Spanish, they better speak in Spanish.
Yeah.
So it was that kind of attitude and spontaneity on her part. And they just told me that, there's a lot of history here that I don't know that I want to find out about. And so I started searching and trying to understand what our history was all about, my own family history, and then later the larger Latino population. And then, of course, I was born in 1945, right at the end of World War II. And, a lot of history has happened since 1945. And I've been a part of it. So, talk about the Chicano movement. I knew most of the Chicano leaders, having grown up in Denver and LA. Corky Gonzalez, Reyes Lopez Tijerina from New Mexico that took over the courthouse. All of those leaders I had an opportunity to interact with. So, I was kind of experiencing that history, and it was just what was happening, during the movement and the struggle for equality that Chicanos went through, and that, Hispanic people have gone through for a long time. So documenting that history just became a part of what I wanted to do. Even though I've been in education all my life, as a counselor and a counselor educator, I've always studied history, and I've always tried to document history. And I'm not so interested in just putting it into archive somewhere. I want people to hear about it, to know about it, to understand their history and relate to it. So that's kind of my story with history.
So what's your favorite part when you do the historical, findings? Is there something that interests you more? Because I know a lot around the Kansas City baseball. That's one of the main things I've heard that you have some amazing documentation of. Like, is that some of your favorite things to collect?
Well, I kind of fell into the baseball story, the Mexican League's baseball story by accident, because I was doing presentations for the Kansas Humanities, and doing presentations on themes around Latinos, Latino immigration, how Mexicans came to Kansas, how they worked the sugar beets, the railroads, the packing houses, all of those kinds of things. So I was going all over Kansas lecturing in libraries and historical societies. And there was a proposal that the Smithsonian Institution out of Washington, D.C., they wanted people to tell hometown stories about whatever their hometowns were about. So some of the people here talked about hometown baseball teams that proliferated since the late 1800s. And so I said, wow, that's interesting. I wonder if I know there were Negro leagues. I wonder if there were Mexican leagues. And so I began to investigate that. And what I found is that, there were a lot of Mexican baseball clubs all around Kansas, Kansas City, Missouri, Kansas City, Kansas, Nebraska, wherever Mexicanos went, they always had their baseball teams. And so I wrote a proposal to get some grant money from the Smithsonian Institution grant that they were giving to states. And so I documented the story of Mexican American baseball in Kansas City and the region, including Omaha, Des Moines, Newton, Kansas, the longest running Mexican American tournament that's going on for 73 years right now.
Wow.
And the Mexican teams that played way back in 1919 when they came after having left Mexico during the Mexican Revolution. So that was just, one of the history projects that I took on, because for one thing, there was grant money to do that research, and I produced a documentary film, and then a book that documents that, called Mexican American Baseball in Kansas City. And that was published by Arcadia Press. But, even before then, I had done another project for Humanities Kansas called Mexican Americans Share Their Stories. And it was about the 51 Flood Reunion group who had been celebrating their survival of the 1951 flood that swept the Cobb Valley and across into the West Bottoms and East Bottoms of Kansas City, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri. So that was really one of the first major history projects that I did, back in the early 1990s. And then I've been going from there to other projects. I was later hired by the Kansas City Museum to document Mexican music and the especially the band orchestra called the Lupe M. Gonzalez Orchestra.
Mhm.
So I did a major exhibit and told his story, which I recently replicated at the Wyandotte County Historical Society. So, there are so many wonderful stories among the Mexican immigrant and Mexican American population, as well as other Latinos, because, the stories we tell are the stories we hear. And if we can hear a story and then retell it with as much accuracy without embellishing it too much, uh, then we can pass that on to the next generation. And, whenever we do storytelling, we always add a little something to it. But I've tried to be historically accurate because that's important especially for scholars, because they say, well, wait a minute, let's do some fact checking here. And it doesn't really check out. But, and some of the stories I'm sure that my grandparents told around the salon on a winter's night or a summer evening were embellished somewhat, but they were telling a basic story that I learned about my culture. And, with today's technology, kids have the technology right in their hands with their cell phone. They could interview their grandparents or great grandparents just by sitting with them and asking some key questions. So that's kind of where I am as far as history is concerned. I want to tell those stories that I've been told so that others might benefit from that history, because that is what history is. It's a series of stories that we tell.
Absolutely. And when you're talking about that right now, when you're talking about the salon, I didn't really have a lot of that experience myself. My aunts, we went to their home a lot. They came to our home. We had a lot of family events, but I have a family of almost 800 people. So it's hard for us to feel like we're a intimate family when there's so many of us. But I do remember my grandparents living on Bellevue, and the Mendezes, who was my grandfather's sister, lived across the street. And they would get together with the Aguirres and the Mendezes and the Garcias, and they'd all play canasta. So it's just amazing to me with all these, you hear the last names and they're so monumental in Kansas City, but I feel like I'm lost a part of history because I don't know a lot of them, nor do I know all the amazing things they've done to build up, like even the West Side and the Northeast Side and just Kansas City in itself. So it's the important work that you do that keeps all of our stories alive.
Yeah, and you mentioned the West Side and all of the history that is there. And a lot of people don't realize that, they think that Mexicans came here just at the time of the Mexican Revolution. But, you know, um, when you think about our presence in Kansas City, all you need to do is think about some street names. And that gives you an inkling of the history that Latinos have made here in this area, in this region. For example, in Johnson County, we have Quivira Street. Well, most people say Quivira, but Quivira Street that runs across Johnson County into Olathe, is very significant if you know the history. Quivira is what the explorers, and especially Coronado, when he left Mexico in 1540 to come to a land that they called Quivira. And it was really a transliteration of what the Indians called this territory. And we call it Quivira today, the street. But Quivira is what the Spanish were looking for when they launched that expedition from Mexico City, up through Western Mexico, up through Arizona, across the Grand Canyon. That expedition led by Coronado was the first time that Europeans had ever seen the Grand Canyon. And they didn't know what to think of it. I mean, it was amazing. How did we cross this thing?
Yeah.
So, and they kept traveling west until they eventually came to New Mexico. And then from New Mexico, they came across what is today the panhandle of Texas and Oklahoma, up around where Ulysses, Kansas is today, and all the way up to through Great Bend, and all the way up to what is the little town of Lindsborg, Kansas. And if you go to Lindsborg, there is a museum there for that documents, because based on some artifacts that they found from that expedition in 1540. Think about it, 1540. Columbus came in 1492, and by this time Coronado was exploring Kansas. At the same time that Ponce de Leon was coming from the east, from Florida, and got all the way to the Mississippi River, and all the while claiming that territory for Spain. So we've been in this territory for a long time. And when people mistakenly say, well, why don't you Mexicans go back to where you came from? I always say, hey, we are where we came from. This is where
right.
we've been for over 500 years. So, and that's part of what I think the Chicano movement was all about is in Spain, there is a saying, people say, vivo yo, I live. And it's like what the Jewish expression is, what am I, chopped liver? Where they say they're wanting to be recognized for the contribution. And I think that's what the Chicano movement was all about. Mm-hmm. Hey, let's recognize and give credit where credit is due to the founders of this nation, who were not the people that landed in 1640 on the East Coast, but people that started in 1540 to come into the state, what is today the state of Kansas. So, 100 years before Plymouth Rock, our ancestors were coming into this territory. And so that's another reason that motivates me to try to tell that story, is to bring about some equity of understanding of the contribution. And then if we would trace the Santa Fe Trail, here's another street that runs through our territory, through both, Kansas and Missouri, the Santa Fe Trail. People think, well, all of these after, Manifest Destiny in the United States wanted to have a nation from sea to shiny sea. Actually, there were more Hispanics who came east on the Santa Fe Trail than there were Anglo and other Germans and others that went west on the Santa Fe Trail. In Santa Fe, which was, again, the headquarters of the northernmost city of the Spanish Empire during the colonial period, they had capitalistas, that is, capitalists, who were doing business, making money. They had trails all the way, the Chihuahua Trail that went all the way to Mexico City. They had the Trail of California that went all the way to the West Coast. And then when the Anglos started trading on the Santa Fe Trail, it was wonderful for them, for the capitalistas of northern Mexico, to take advantage of that trail. They would come on that trail, purchase wholesale, bring it back on the trail, and sell it throughout the Hispanic world. So, people think the Santa Fe Trail was a one-way thoroughfare going west. No, it was a two-way thoroughfare with Hispanic people coming and bringing their influence into Kansas City. And so Hispanics didn't start, with the settlement of Mexican immigrants from 1910 to 1921. It started a long time before that. And so I think it's important that we understand and put history into its proper perspective, so that people, you talk to many non-Hispanic people, even in other parts of the country and or in our own city, and they say, what, there are Mexicans in Kansas City?
Right.
How did they get there? Well, we got here starting in 1540, and we've been coming here ever since, to not only take jobs that no one else will take sometimes, but to contribute in many wonderful ways to the culture and the diversity of our area, as we've always done.
Yes.
So anyway, that's my little soapbox version of why it's important for us to know our history.
Never knew that about Quivira. I actually lived off of Quivira growing up, so that's fascinating to learn. You could talk all night about all the different street names. I'm for sure
Oh,
about all the
yeah,
history.
you think about the Paseo. It's really El Paseo that that is the a street name in Mexico City, and because they wanted to honor President the founders of Kansas City, some of the Anglo founders and German founders and others, when they put in that Grand Avenue, it reminded them of El Paseo de la Reforma in Mexico City, and so that's why they named it. They didn't say El Paseo; they said the Paseo. I guess anglicized it or let them know what La meant. But so even the Country Club Plaza, shows the influence that Spain had on J.C. Nichols when he went to Spain to Sevilla. If you ever go to Seville, Spain, like many people have, and I went during their festival of San Juan, which is the fall, or excuse me, in July. And they found out I was from Kansas City. They said, "Oh, you're a sister city of ours." And so, yeah, when you go take a buggy ride around Sevilla in Spain, it's so much like the Country Club Plaza. It's amazing. So that's really what J.C. Nichols tried to replicate, is that influence from Spain.
And I know, wonderful. Before we get started on your presentation that you have, I want to ask you a question. You
Sure.
mentioned about the Chicano movement. What was that like? Can you give us just a little insight of being a part of that and knowing the people that were doing that amazing movement?
Well, you have to remember that the Chicano movement started in places like Los Angeles, El Paso, Texas, Laredo, Texas, border towns, and even Denver, where I grew up. And I grew up in Denver and LA. So my older brothers were all Pachucos. I don't know if our audience knows what Pachucos were, but Pachucos, and we recently had a Pachuco festival.
Yeah.
Rupert Aguirre is a great lover of history, and so he called me and said, "Hey, how do we tell the Pachuco story?" And I said, "Well, hey, we start by telling the history of the cities where the Pachuco movement started." And it was really the Pachucos tried to replicate the zoot suit, which really started among African Americans, the black people, and guys like Calloway with his band. He always wore like a zoot suit. And so the Chicanos saw that and say they liked that style. And they were, because, at the heart of this Pachuco movement was the desire to make a statement like, because of that lack of respect that they sensed, where they were dually marginalized. In other words, hey, when they went to Mexico, he said, well, you guys are like pochos. You don't speak good Spanish. So they experienced that marginalization in Mexico. Well, here in the United States, they said, well, you're Chavez or you're Lopez or you're Munoz. Are you from Mexico? And so you had to kind of choose and say, well, no, I wasn't born in Mexico. I'm from the United States. But well, you're Mexican. So here they were marginalized and saying, well, you're not fully American, you're not fully Mexican. So what are you? They said, well, the heck with it all. We're Chicanos. We're going to be who we are. And that's really the word Chicano evolved from a Pachuco word of self-identity, saying, hey, we are Pachucos. We're neither from Mexico, but we're born in the United States of Mexican heritage, and we're cool and we're hip, and get off my back, And don't tell me to sit in back row, because I'm not going to sit there. Don't tell me to sit on that side of the theater, because I'm not going to sit there. And so their theme became, ya basta, it's enough. We
Mm-hmm.
don't want this disrespect because we're neither fully Mexican or neither considered fully American. We are who we are. Somos Chicanos, and damn proud of it. So that was the
Yes.
attitude that Chicanos had, and my brothers kind of passed that on to me, my older brothers, and so during the Chicano movement, I grew up in again Denver and Los Angeles, but Denver was a hotbed of the Chicano movement because of the Crusade for Justice when Corky Gonzalez established the Crusade for Justice. And I can remember going to the state capitol in Denver on the Capitol steps and protesting and demanding housing rights and better education for our youth. And I was just, a young man at that point. But I got to interact with all of the leaders of the Chicano movement who would come and support the work of the Crusade for Justice. And later on, when I went to Arizona State University to do my master's and my doctorate, I started an organization called Raza Graduate Student Caucus. And what we, as graduate students, did is we invited the leaders of the Chicano movement to come and do symposia and be speakers and so forth at Arizona State. And so in that way, I got to meet most of the leaders of the movement from across the country. And one of the things that we did at Arizona State was say, hey, there's no Office of Minority Affairs. And at that point in 76, when I first went there and stayed till 80, there was no Office of Minority Affairs at Arizona State University. And so the study that I did for my dissertation was the perception of Chicano, Black, and Anglo students of the university environment. And what I found out is that Black students were the most diverse group along four variables, about what they felt at the university. But in a city like Phoenix, where it was almost 20% Mexicano, Chicano, there was only 4% attending Arizona State. So I was sponsored by the Dean of Student Affairs, and we started a center for not only Chicano studies, but a center that later became an Office of Minority Affairs, so that they could begin effectively recruiting Chicano and other Latino students. So, it was a time of activism. The whole country, the Black movement led by many wonderful Black leaders, including Dr. Martin Luther King, they were inspirational. I mean, I remember hearing Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech on the radio.
Wow.
I was a college student and just being mesmerized by his speech and inspired to do something for my own people the same way he was doing it.
Mm-hmm.
So people became inspired, I don't know if your audience has ever seen the, and I'm going to pull up a slide presentation real quick. Let's see if I can do this with the technology.
Yes. And I'm going to put myself.
I'm going to go with this one instead of that other one because I kind of talked through that other presentation. But okay. Can you see the slide presentation?
Can you hear me, Jean? Can you hear me, Dr.
Yeah,
Chavez? Yeah. Okay, perfect. Yes, we can see it now. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Now I can't see you, but I can see the slide. So, well, I call this presentation the Latino struggle for equality. And it's really important, I think, that we understand that we have had to struggle and actually survive the American macro culture. You know, the United States is a nation of immigrants, and we've sort of developed a macro culture, and in that macro culture, I'll get down to that slide. So the multicultural nature of our nation is that we have an American macro culture, and in that macro culture that we call the USA, United States of America, there are many other microcultures in and around the American macro culture. In the American macro culture, we speak English. In some of the microcultures, for example, let's take Native American Indian microculture. You can see that it overlaps the American macroculture, but they still speak their native languages. They maintain Navajo and Lakota and Dakota and other indigenous languages. In the Hispanic or Latino, and a new term that's being used, Latinx culture, you know, some of us still maintain Spanish. I was fortunate in that my parents both spoke Spanish. They read and wrote Spanish. I have other relatives in New Mexico that were scholars and studied the history. And so I was fortunate to have the privilege of going and visiting my grandparents and hearing them speak in Spanish. And plus I had the opportunity to attend a Spanish-speaking church as a kid. And so being able to maintain Spanish was very important to me. So I can go in and out of the American macro culture. When I'm in the American macro culture, I can speak English. And I've kind of developed a Midwestern accent. People still think I have a strange accent. They'll ask me, where are you from? I'm from Denver and LA. I say, where are you from? But, you know, but I can go to Mexico or any Latin American country or New Mexico where my relatives still live and speak Spanish. And I'm really most comfortable when I go back home because I consider New Mexico home, even though I grew up in Denver and LA and now live here, because that's really where my roots are, my ancestral roots. And so I can go home and just exhale and breathe, sit back and relax, and don't have to change my name. You know, I don't have to be Gene T. Chavez. I can be Genovevo Teodoro Chavez Ortiz, because that's the names on my birth certificate. You know, and that reflects my family history on both sides of the family. And so one of the things that I think we fail to recognize is that we don't have to acculturate fully to the American macro culture. Yes, we have to acculturate, but we don't have to fully assimilate into the American macro culture. We can maintain our foods, our language, our customs, our bailes, our wonderful, beautiful culture, whatever it might be, whether it's from Mexico or from Peru or from Venezuela or wherever. We have the freedom in the United States to exercise our freedom. You know, I remember when I was working in a high school in Arizona, when I was working on my doctorate, I was working in a special program, but I would always go to the cafeteria and greet the cafeteria staff because they were all Spanish speaking in Spanish. And then the custodians were all Spanish speaking. I talked to them in Spanish. And the principal called me into his office one time and said, you know, we're trying to get all of our workers to speak English. So I would just appreciate it if you would speak English only to them. And I said, well, I'll speak English to them, but I'm not going to give up speaking Spanish to them because that's who they are and that's meaningful to them. And I said, and by the way, I know you know the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, and there is a clause about freedom of speech. We as Americans have the right to speak any language that we choose to speak. Now, I'm not going to speak any language in a way to offend you, that I'm trying to exclude you, but I have a right to speak Spanish anytime I want to. Mm-hmm. And so he backed off because I said, and if you make it a policy, I'll see you at the board. And so sometimes, you have to have that Chicano bravado to say, hey, ya basta, it's enough.
Yeah, absolutely.
So going back to the first slide here, when Hernan Cortez captured Tenochtitlan, what is today Mexico City, in 1519 and finished the conquest of Mexico City in 1521, the Indian people were subjugated. And I think another thing that the Chicano movement stood for was to say, wait a minute, here these Europeans come riding their horses in full armor and conquer our people and rob us of our freedom. And so that struggle between the colonizer and the colonized has gone on for centuries. And it happened to our own people. We can't say that the Hispanic people were not ruthless in their subjugation of the indigenous people. And then later they brought slaves to the America, of course, and further segmented, societies and created class systems that, were not always fair and equitable to all people, and especially the indigenous people and the African slaves, some of whom mixed with Europeans, some of them mixed with the Indians. The people of color, especially dark-skinned people, were always at the bottom of the rung. Throughout the history of the colonial Spanish territory, which lasted for 300 years, longer than the United States has been a nation, people of color have been subjugated by light complexioned Europeans. And I'm, a light complexion, mostly European with not too much indigenous mixture. But, I still believe that it's important that we honor the struggle of the Chicano movement to bring liberty and equity to all people. And there's a YouTube site. You might your audience might take a screenshot of that. But this tells the epic poem that Corky Gonzalez, one of the leaders of the Chicano movement, who was the director of the Crusade for Justice in Denver, he wrote an epic poem called I Am Joaquin. And he traces that history from the conquest of the Spaniards and down to the present Chicano struggle that he was involved with through an epic poem that is just amazing. So if your audience have not read it or heard it, they need to tune into that. So, the struggle continues when you think about it. And our people in large numbers, when you talk about the Coronado expedition or the the migrations coming east on the Santa Fe Trail, you have to remember that the mass majority of people came from Mexico. And by the way, Mexicans are still the largest Latino ethnic population in the United States. So we, as Mexican Americans, our ancestors coming from Mexico still comprise the large percentage of Latinos in the United States. The mass migration happened between 1910 and 1930. And it is estimated that over 1 million immigrants, mostly from Mexico, migrated north to find work and to find respite from the Mexican Revolution that lasted from 1910 to 1921. But that migration continued after the Mexican Revolution, and people came in large numbers. And if they weren't decisive about whether or not they should come to the United States during this period, there were plenty of companies, including the industries of meat packing, the railroads, the agricultural interests. They would literally send agents down to the Mexican border into Mexican towns and recruit workers to come and work in the United States during this period of 1910 to 1930. And so it was from those border towns that people were distributed throughout the United States. And really, at one time, the state of Kansas and Missouri, our area, they're called the Colonia, on the Kansas side, which encompassed Argentine, Armourdale, Rosedale, and then the west side, that was called the Mexican Colonia during this period of 1910 to 1930. And at one time, it was actually the largest expatriate Mexican population in the United States. There were more Mexicans in that Colonia than anywhere else in the United States in this early period of migration of Mexicanos. And so, the acculturation process where two cultures come together often leads to assimilation of first generation Latino Americans. So by the 1920s and 1950s, you had the descendants of that early mass migration coming of age, fighting in World War II, and then still experiencing discrimination because they were slow to assimilate. Now, the difference between assimilation and acculturation is where you take on certain aspects of the host culture. Assimilation is where you give up completely your native culture and assimilate to the host culture. And but Mexicanos, whether it was given their proximity to Mexico or the strong roots that they felt and allegiance to Mexico that their parents felt, all the songs like Mexico Lindo y Querido and all of those songs that the Mexicans brought with them kept them longing for the home country and could often hold dual citizenship during this period of time. So the Mexican immigrants were often citizens of the United States by naturalization, but they could keep their Mexican citizenship. And so Mexicans were slow to assimilate, mostly because we felt like we had something good and we didn't want to give it up. So I think that's an important thing. Assimilation, of course, usually starts with the second generation of Latin Americans. But even to this day, in our area, Kansas City, the struggle to survive the American macroculture still goes on. And we're not ready to say, hey, we're Americans first and Latinos second, even though we know that's the case, by citizenship. But we want to maintain our identity as Latinos. Identity is a really interesting phenomenon. And when we think about identity, see if I can find the slide I want. It's not here. And the rest of this PowerPoint we'll save for the next time we talk. But I wanted to talk a little bit about our ethnic identity because identity is something that is really a psychological mindset. Yes, if I would ask you, what is your ethnic identity? How would you respond? Diana.
Ethnic identity. Yeah. So, yeah. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Can you
I
hear
can
me,
hear you.
Jean?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I can't tell if the screen's on or not. So,
Okay.
we
Are you able to hear
okay.
me? Okay,
Yeah,
go
I can
ahead.
hear you now. So, we had this conversation with my family just 2 days ago, actually, because my kids, see themselves as being American because they're born in America, because their grandparents are from Mexico. They're here from Mexico, and they see them, like, their grandparents, as like these amazing people that are from the country that they love, right? They cherish, they they love to learn about, and they want to be a part of, but they know that they've never been there. They don't have that connection to actually have set foot there and live there and breathe it, and so they have to get that through their grandparents.
Yeah.
And so Mexican American is definitely how we see ourselves, and that's why definitely see myself as a Chicana, because I long to be Mexican for 110%. It's in my heart and it's in my blood, but at the same time, I've never even been there. All I have is the rich culture and beautifulness that comes from my family, that they installed in me, and not having set foot there. Does that make sense?
Oh, definitely. And that's what I'm talking about. It is your mindset, your psychological construct of who you are based on your experience with your family, uh, and your what you've gained through the interaction. So that gives you a mindset. So if people ask you, "What are you?" you're likely to say, "Oh, I'm Mexican,"
Yeah,
or you might say, "I'm Mexican American." But there are
right.
people, for example, who've never been to Mexico, will say, "Well, I'm Mexican." My grandkids sometimes are confused. They say, "Well, Grandpa, what are you?" And I said, "It depends on who I'm talking to.
Right.
If I'm in LA, on East Los, where I grew up, and I'm talking to guys like Cheech and Chong, I say, "Órale, ese, soy chicano, ese." So that's if I'm with them, my mindset is that I'm Chicano. Well, what does Chicano mean? Well, Chicano means that I'm an American of Mexican heritage who's not willing to take any crap from anybody who's going to tell me about it. Okay.
I love that.
Yeah. If I'm in an academic setting and they say, "Well, what do you think of the word Hispano or Hispanic?" Well, I'd say that was my mom's mindset. My mom, people came from Spain. She could trace her ancestry all the way back to Spain. And when she talked about herself, she didn't say I'm Mexican because she was brought up in the time when it was part of the viceroyalty of New Spain, and they all thought of themselves as Hispanos, from which we get the word Hispanic, which means coming from Spain. Spain in the Latin is España with an H. The H is not pronounced España, so they call themselves Hispanos, coming from Spain. Now, if you're from Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula, that shares the peninsula with Spain, you think of yourself as Portuguese or Brazilian if you're in the Americas. You don't call yourself Hispanic. You're Portuguese, Portuguese. So that's we are. I could say, well, my mindset is I'm Earthling. I'm nothing more than Earth. You know, if that's my mindset, but I haven't done intergalactic travel yet, so I consider myself as Chicano if I'm in East LA or certain parts of Denver. If I'm talking to people in New Mexico, somos Hispanos. If I'm in Latin America, like any Latin American country, I can say somos Latinos, and they know,
Yeah.
well, yeah, we are Latinos. That unites. It's a big umbrella that takes in 24 countries of Latin America. And even Brazilians can identify with Latino because it harkens back to our Latin roots. And that's where our languages come from. Portuguese comes from Latin, Spanish comes from Latin, and all the other languages of Spain come from Latin. So we say somos Latinos, Latin America, Latin Americans. It depends on our mindset where and a lot of that is influenced by our experiences. So like you know what sopa de fideo is, you know what sopa de arroz is. That's all Mexican food. You know what chicharrones are. You because you've experienced that. You know what chile verde, chile uh, uh, menudo. Who knows about menudo? Right? The world doesn't know about menudo. We know about menudo because we've experienced it. So that gives us a mindset based on our experiences. And so, when young people today call themselves Latinx, at first oh, wow, okay, all right. But I got to thinking about it. Wait a minute. That's the same thing. My mom was very offended when my brother started it, and we started calling ourselves Chicanos. Que Chicano, ni Chicano. You're not Chicanos, you're Hispanos. What are you And I said, so we of course didn't make it a big issue with her because we didn't want to offend her. But when we were away from home, we were Chicano. When we were at home, of course, we were Hispanos. And I actually got in fights a lot of times because some of the darker complexion Mexicano kids where I grew up, they would ask me, well, what are you? Are you a güero? Mm-hmm. I said, don't be güero, and so I said, and I would actually fight kids. I'm as much Mexicano as you are. Well, at that point, I was with Mexicano, so I defended my sense of identity as a Mexican. So our sense of identity changes. We have an adopted son, and he's not Hispanic at all. And so one time he asked me, well, what does our last name mean? What does Chavez mean? And I said, well, it means keys. It comes from Villa de Chavez in Spain. And it was a city that had 5 gates with 5 keys. The Latin word for key, llave, is chave. And I said, it means keys. He said, well, can I change my name? I said, well, when you get 18 and you want to go to court and have your name legally changed, you can do that. And guess what? He never changed his name, and he finds it an advantage to be a Chavez. He's a registered nurse. And he's sometimes mistaken and said, well, can you speak Spanish? These people don't speak. Well, he knows enough Spanish to get him by. So, his mindset has changed from the time that he was growing up. And, and he ate tortillas and chile and all the stuff that I did. So, culturally, he has that experience, even though he's puro blanco, pure white.
Well, and I love this, that you have the experience and that you've lived this, because I feel like as generations go on, they don't know what it was like for my own father, who came from Guanajuato, Mexico, who had a lot of issues here in the West Side growing up. He was very poor, didn't speak a lot of English, and he always said from that point on he was never going to allow his own family to have to go through what he did. And I love that you understand that, because like you said, it's what you live and it's what you breathe and it's what you learn and it's what you respect and it's what you love that makes you who you are. And you embrace that culture. And I feel like when we tell people just because you don't know a language, there are so many reasons behind that, probably, as to why we don't. And the history is what helps us understand those pieces.
Yeah. Well, and again, that's why I say we survive the American macro culture, because the American macro culture puts a lot of pressure on people to speak English, to be American. They often, you've heard it. People say, well, why can't you all just be Americans? Mm-hmm. And what they mean is, why can't you be English speaking apple pie loving,
Yes.
patriotic, consumeristic um, Americans.
Hmm.
And fortunately, some of us know that we don't have to be all that the American macro culture dictates that we be. We can be who we are and celebrate who we are. And that's where you know, I think it's important that we celebrate our diversity. But in order to do that, we have to learn about it and we have to help young people to say, hey, I have every right to be who I am without trying to be made in somebody else's image. You know, and nor do I need to try to make somebody else into my image. You know, the
Yes.
basic human need is that for respect, for possession, for sensory satisfaction. You know, those are basic human needs. And if we're not respected, if we don't have some sense of possession, that we possess our home, our land, our
Hmm.
territory, then we're not being fulfilled as humans.
Right.
And you know, we sensory satisfaction, what we see, touch, hear, taste. I mean, if I don't have my Chile fix at least two or three times a week, then my sense of taste is gone. You know, I can't eat that bland food every day. You know,
You
so
sound like my dad. My dad says the same thing.
exactly. So you know, we we have to be completely fulfilled in understanding our needs as basic humans. Uh, you know, and the need for security, and that's one of the reasons why I think uh, it's important that we really work towards equity and break down the walls of discrimination and mistrust that people have with one another. And so my aim and goal through my work in life is to help people understand one another and know that hey, we have every right to be respected, and in the same way that I'm going to respect you, I expect you to respect me, and I want to learn about you, and I want to understand you, and I want to celebrate you,
Yes.
and so if we can all do that, then I think we can go a long ways to bringing about a greater country, make America great again. Thomas, right?
Exactly. Well, Dr. Chavez, we have about 1 minute left, and I want you to, first of all, tell us what you're going to be bringing back because we're going to set up another time to talk to you again. So tell us what your next episode will be, and then anything you want to tell the viewership. We have a very wide range of viewers. You know, younger, older, Chicanos, not Chicanos. You know, Latinos, Latinx. You know, so anything you want to tell our viewers.
Yeah. What I'm hoping to discuss is really get a little bit more into some of the organizations that have evolved out of the civil rights era, and some of the activists that were right here in Kansas City.
Yes,
And
that's awesome.
you know, Cesar Chavez came to Kansas City, and there were people here boycotting lettuce and grapes in the grocery stores. And I want to tell about some of the leaders of Kansas City that really brought the movement here. And whether they thought of themselves as Chicano activists, they were certainly activists and were bringing about change to bring about greater equity in Kansas City. And I have a website, and I'll be posting like these PowerPoints and so forth. It's called Nuestra Herencia KC. So if you go to Nuestra, Nuestra, Herencia, Herencia dash KC, you can see some of the PowerPoints and so forth. And the thing I would tell everybody, get your iPhone out, your smartphone, and start recording your ancestors, your stories. The stories we hear are the stories we tell. And I'll tell a little bit about some of the stories that I'm collecting for the Kansas City Museum and the Kansas City, Missouri Public Libraries. to do oral histories. So I've been doing oral history interviews for about the last 10 years. And I'll share some. Yeah.
That'll be wonderful. We appreciate you being here, Dr. Chavez. We appreciate all the work you're doing and sharing it amongst us, because we have you'll see the comments if you go back on. I didn't want to interrupt you, but there were a lot of people here very interested. And then Sarah Chavez, who actually did not know the meaning of her last name, so she said thank you for telling her.
I know Sarah. Hey, Sarah.
She said in Topeka it was Our Lady of Guadalupe Church community in Oakland that supported the UFW boycotts. So that's a little bit of history right there as well. I cannot wait to hear about the leaders and activists that were in Kansas City.
All right. Looking forward to it.
Me too. Have a great evening and stay well.
All right. You too. Take care.
Bye.